Eve's life is turned upside down when a mysterious envelope appears on her doorstep one rainy evening, containing an old key and a cryptic note. What door does this key unlock? And why was it sent to her, an ordinary librarian with no ties to the past it hints at? Driven by an unshakable curiosity, Eve begins to unravel a centuries-old mystery hidden within the fog-shrouded corners of her small town. What secrets lie behind the door the key was meant to open? Who are the shadowy figures now hunting her, and what ancient knowledge are they so desperate to protect? The Forgotten Key is a gripping tale of mystery, danger, and the hidden forces that shape our world. But the deeper you go, the more you'll wonder, who can you trust when your past, your present, and even your future are all in question? Chapter 1: The Stranger in the Rain. The rain fell in a steady rhythm, its quiet drumming against the roof of the small-town library where Eve worked. The dim light inside the building created long shadows that danced across the shelves, amplifying the silence that hung in the air. Eve, as usual, was the last one there, closing up for the night. She moved through the aisles, carefully checking that all the books were in order, each one in its proper place. The smell of old paper and leather bindings was comforting, a familiar scent that made her feel at home. Outside, the night was dark and heavy with the mist rising from the wet streets. Eve glanced out the large front window as she approached the front desk, and that's when she saw it, a figure standing just outside the circle of light cast by the street lamp. The person was still, almost too still, as if they were waiting for something. Or someone. A shiver ran down Eve's spine. She wasn't one to scare easily, but there was something unnerving about the stranger's presence. She forced herself to look away and continued with her routine, locking the doors and turning off the lights. But when she looked out the window again, the figure was gone. Eve hurried outside, pulling her coat tightly around her as she stepped into the drizzle. The street was deserted, the mist swallowing up the buildings around her. The sense of unease lingered as she walked home, her footsteps echoing in the quiet night. When she reached her apartment, she paused at the door, her breath catching in her throat. A plain, unmarked envelope lay on the doorstep, soaked from the rain. Eve bent down to pick it up, her heart skipping a beat. There was no name, no address, just a feeling of wrongness that made her fingers tremble as she opened it. Inside was a single, small key, old and tarnished, with a note folded neatly beside it. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, as if the writer had been racing against time. Eve. This key unlocks a door to the past. A door that has remained hidden for many years, buried under layers of time and memory. The answers you seek lie in the oldest part of town, where history clings to the stones and shadows. But be careful, others are searching too, and not all of them are friendly. Trust no one, and remember, the door may not look like a door at all. A friend. Eve stared at the note, her mind racing. What door? What past? The message was cryptic, yet it hinted at something significant, something that involved her directly. The key in her hand felt cold, almost heavy with the weight of its importance. She tried to think of any door in town that this key might fit, but nothing came to mind immediately. She looked around her small apartment, the familiar surroundings suddenly feeling distant and strange. Who could have sent this? And what was so important that it required such secrecy? The last line of the note lingered in her thoughts. The door may not look like a door at all. The rain outside intensified, tapping against the window like fingers drumming in impatience. Eve placed the key and note on the small table by the door, her mind whirling with questions she had no answers to. Sleep was out of the question now, she needed to know more. Eve grabbed her umbrella and headed back to the library. She had a hunch that whatever this key was for, the answer might be found in the dusty, forgotten corners of the library's oldest collections. The place where history lingered, untouched and undisturbed, just as the note had suggested. As Eve's fingers closed around the mysterious key, her mind swirled with questions. What door could it possibly open? And who was the friend who had sent it to her? She felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her, an irresistible pull into a world she had never imagined. What do you think the key unlocks? Leave your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear your theories. Chapter 2: Clues in the Stacks. The library was silent as Eve unlocked the doors and stepped inside, the soft glow from her lantern casting eerie shadows on the walls. She made her way to the back of the building, where the oldest books were kept, volumes that rarely saw the light of day, filled with the town's long-forgotten histories and legends. Eve's heart pounded with anticipation as she began to search, pulling down old, leather-bound books and placing them carefully on the long oak table. She flipped through pages of yellowed paper, scanning for anything that might hint at a hidden door, a lost key, or a forgotten part of the town's past. Hours passed, the lantern's light flickering as the night grew deeper. Eve's eyes ached from reading, but she pushed on, driven by the mystery that had been thrust into her life. It wasn't until she opened an old town ledger, dated from the late 1800s, that she found something that made her pause. The ledger was a record of the town's buildings and properties, meticulously documented by the town clerk at the time. Eve's eyes scanned the names and descriptions until she came across a curious entry. And the building at the edge of the old district, though no longer in use, remains sealed with the iron key. The door, hidden in plain sight, is marked only by the emblem of the lion. Eve's breath caught. The emblem of the lion. She recalled the note's mention that the door might not look like a door at all. And the key she had been given, it was old, certainly old enough to be the one mentioned in the ledger. She leaned closer to the book, her finger tracing the faded ink. The old district, the part of town that was mostly abandoned now, where buildings stood empty and forgotten. A door that was hidden, sealed long ago with an iron key. Could this be what the note had referred to? The more Eve thought about it, the more certain she became. This had to be the door the key opened, the one that held the secrets hinted at in the note. But why had this knowledge been hidden for so long? And why had it been entrusted to her? Eve knew she had to find this door. She needed to know what lay behind it, even if it meant facing the unknown dangers that came with it. The town's old district was only a short walk away, and with the night still cloaking the town in darkness, she could investigate without drawing too much attention. Chapter 3: The Door in the Shadows. The old district was shrouded in mist as Eve approached, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. The buildings here were relics of a bygone era, their windows dark and their doors sealed with rusted locks. The streets were narrow, the cobblestones slick from the rain, and the shadows seemed to shift and move as Eve walked cautiously among them. She knew she was close. The ledger had mentioned a lion's emblem, a symbol that would mark the door she sought. Eve's eyes scanned the walls of the buildings she passed, looking for any sign of the emblem, any hint of the door that had been hidden for so long. Finally, she saw it. Tucked away in a narrow alley, almost invisible in the dim light, was a door that looked as if it had been forgotten by time. It was black, heavy, and barely distinguishable from the wall it was set into. But there, at eye level, was a small, iron plaque shaped like a lion's head, its eyes fierce and its mouth slightly open as if in a silent roar. Eve's heart raced as she approached the door. This was it, the door the note had spoken of, the door that her key would unlock. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled the key from her pocket and fitted it into the lock. The metal was cold against her skin, and for a moment, she hesitated, the weight of what she was about to uncover pressing down on her. But her curiosity won out. She turned the key, and with a soft click, the lock released. Eve pushed the door open, and it swung inward with a creak, revealing a dark, narrow hallway beyond. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust and something else, something old and faintly metallic. Eve stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. The walls were lined with wooden beams, and the floor beneath her creaked with each step. At the end of the hallway was another door, this one slightly ajar. Eve felt a surge of adrenaline as she approached it, her mind racing with possibilities. What would she find beyond this door? Answers? Or more questions? She pushed the door open and stepped into a small room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was cluttered with old furniture, covered in sheets, and stacks of yellowed papers. In the center of the room was a desk, its surface littered with documents and a single, dusty book. Eve's gaze was drawn to the book. It looked ancient, its leather cover cracked and worn. She reached out and lifted it carefully, her fingers brushing away the dust. The title was faint, barely legible, The Chronicles of the Crimson Key. Her breath caught. The Crimson Key, the name sent a shiver through her. She had never heard of it before, but something about it felt significant, as if it held the answers she had been searching for. Eve opened the book, her hands trembling slightly as she began to read. The pages were filled with symbols and codes, interspersed with names and dates. It was a ledger of sorts, a record of something old and secretive. But what caught her attention most was a series of entries near the back, detailing the existence of a hidden society that had operated in the shadows for centuries. The Crimson Key, according to the book, was more than just an organization. It was a guardian of secrets, a keeper of ancient knowledge that had been deemed too dangerous for the world to know. And now, it seemed, Eve had been drawn into their web. As she read, Eve felt a growing sense of unease. This was more than she had bargained for. The note, the key, the door, everything was connected to something far larger and more dangerous than she had imagined. And now, she was in the middle of it. A sound behind her made Eve jump. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there, only the faint creak of the floorboards, as if someone had just been standing behind her. Eve's mind raced. She had to leave, had to get out before whoever was watching found her. She grabbed the book and shoved it into her bag, her heart pounding as she made her way back to the hallway. Just as she reached the front door, she heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the shadows. Eve froze, fear tightening in her chest. Someone was there, someone who didn't want her to leave. She turned and bolted down the hallway, the door to the street just within reach. But as she reached for the handle, the door swung open, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the night. Leaving so soon, the man's voice was cold, his presence blocking her only escape route. Eve's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of panic. She was trapped, with no way out. But as she stared at the man, something in her shifted, a determination to survive, to uncover the truth no matter the cost. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The man smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. "I'm someone who knows far more than you should." With that, he reached out to grab her, but Eve was faster. She ducked under his arm and ran back down the hallway, her only thought to escape, to survive. She didn't look back as she sprinted through the building, the echoes of her footsteps merging with those of the man chasing her. When she reached a side door, she pushed it open and burst into the rain-soaked alley beyond. The cold air hit her like a shock, but she didn't stop. She ran through the narrow streets, her heart pounding, the book in her bag feeling heavier with each step. The town's old district loomed around her like a dark maze, but she didn't care, she just needed to get away. Finally, when she was far enough, Eve slowed down, leaning against a wall to catch her breath. She had escaped, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The people who wanted the key, who knew about the door and the secrets it hid, wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Eve clutched the book in her bag, the key still in her pocket. She had to figure out what this all meant, what the Crimson Key was, and why she had been dragged into their world. And she had to do it fast, before they found her again. Chapter 4, Hidden Truths. Eve didn't go home that night. Instead, she found refuge in a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of town. The room was shabby, the walls thin, but it was safe, or at least safer than the dark streets outside. She bolted the door behind her and pulled out the book, her mind still reeling from the night's events. As she read through the pages again, Eve began to piece together the puzzle. The Crimson Key was not just a society, it was a powerful force that had shaped history from the shadows. The book detailed their operations, their influence over governments and knowledge, and their ruthless methods to protect their secrets. But why had they chosen her? Why was she given the key? As Eve pondered these questions, she realized something: the key wasn't just a tool to open a door. It was a symbol, a sign that she had been chosen for something, though she didn't yet know what. The book spoke of trials, of initiations, and of those who had failed and disappeared without a trace. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Eve's heart leapt into her throat. She hadn't expected anyone to find her here. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Eve approached the door cautiously, her hand hovering over the knob. She was about to ask who it was when a voice from the other side called out softly, "Eve, I'm a friend. I'm here to help you." She froze. The voice was unfamiliar, but there was something in the tone that calmed her, something that hinted at sincerity. Eve hesitated for a moment longer, then slowly unlocked the door. When she opened it, a man stood before her, drenched from the rain, his expression serious but not threatening. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with suspicion. The man smiled faintly. "My name is Daniel. And if you want to survive what's coming, you need to trust me." Chapter 5, The Pact. Eve eyed Daniel warily, the tension in the small motel room thick with unspoken questions. His clothes clung to him, soaked from the rain, but he seemed unbothered, his gaze steady on her. "Why should I trust you?" Eve asked, her fingers still gripping the edge of the door. The events of the night had left her shaken, and trusting a stranger, even one who claimed to know so much, didn't come easily. "Because you have no one else," Daniel replied calmly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken truths. "And because I know what's coming for you." Eve hesitated, her mind racing. The man before her was a stranger, yet he had knowledge that could be her only lifeline. His eyes, though intense, held no malice, only a deep weariness and something that could be concern. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. "Nothing but to help you survive," Daniel said, stepping back slightly, giving her space. "You have something they want, and they won't stop until they get it. I can help you figure out what it is and why it's so important." Eve studied him, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and curiosity. She knew she couldn't navigate this situation alone, whatever this was. And if Daniel truly understood the danger she was in, he might be her only hope. Finally, she stepped aside. "Come in," she said, her voice firm but cautious. "But if you try anything." "I won't," Daniel cut in, his tone reassuring. "I'm here to help you, not hurt you." Eve closed the door behind him, locking it with a sense of finality. Daniel surveyed the sparse motel room before shrugging off his wet coat and draping it over a chair. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the tension of unspoken questions. "What do we do now?" Eve asked, keeping her distance. Daniel turned to face her, his expression serious. "Now, we need to piece together what you know and what you don't. The fact that they gave you that key means they believe you're the only one who can find what they're looking for. We need to understand why." Eve frowned. "But I don't know anything about this vault or the Crimson Key. I only found out about them tonight." "Exactly," Daniel said, crossing his arms. "And that's what we need to figure out. There's something in your past, something you've been connected to without realizing it. That's what we have to uncover before they do." Eve's mind whirled. Her past had always seemed so ordinary, so devoid of anything remarkable. What could possibly connect her to something as dangerous as this shadowy organization? Daniel could see the doubt in her eyes. "Look," he said, softening his tone, "I know this is overwhelming. But we need to focus on what we do know. The key, the note, the book you found, all of these are pieces of a larger puzzle. We just have to figure out how they fit together." Eve nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the situation was pressing down on her, but she knew there was no turning back now. "All right," she said finally. "Where do we start?" Daniel's gaze flickered to the old leather-bound book on the table. "We start with this." Chapter 6, Unraveling the Cipher. The night dragged on as Eve and Daniel sat hunched over the book, its cryptic symbols and ancient codes filling every page. The air in the motel room was thick with concentration, the only sound the occasional rustling of paper as they turned the pages. Daniel was the first to notice it, a pattern in the symbols, a sequence that seemed to repeat at irregular intervals throughout the text. "Look at this," he said, tapping the page with a finger. "This symbol, it keeps showing up, always in the same context. It's like a marker." Eve leaned closer, her brow furrowed as she studied the symbol. It was a simple design, an intertwined pattern that resembled both a key and a lock. A flicker of recognition sparked in her memory. "It's guiding us," Eve murmured, tracing the symbol with her fingertip. "But where?" They continued to scan the pages, following the trail of symbols. Each time the pattern appeared, it pointed to something, a name, a place, a date. And then, finally, the sequence led them to a page near the back of the book. "This must be it," Daniel said, his voice tense with anticipation. "But the text here is encoded, it's a location, but we need to break the cipher." Eve stared at the page. The letters were jumbled, the words scrambled into an indecipherable mess. "What kind of cipher is this?" It's a substitution cipher, Daniel explained. Common in ancient texts. The key to it could be anything, an object, a number, a name. Eve's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the letters. Then a thought struck her. What if the key isn't just a key? Daniel looked at her, intrigued. What do you mean? The note said the key unlocks a door to the past, Eve said, her voice rising with excitement. But what if it's more than that? What if it's the key to the cipher, too? Daniel's eyes widened. You think the key could be the code? Eve nodded. It's possible. The key is old, just like this book. Maybe the notches, the shape, maybe they correspond to the letters in the cipher. Daniel grabbed the key from the table and held it up to the page. Let's try it. They worked together, using the shape of the key to decode the scrambled letters. Slowly, painstakingly, the cipher began to reveal its secrets. The letters fell into place, forming words that made sense, a message hidden for centuries. As the final word was deciphered, Eve leaned back, her heart racing. The location was clear now, a place she recognized all too well. The old stone chapel, Eve whispered. The chapel was a ruin on the outskirts of town, abandoned for generations and nearly forgotten. But now, it seemed to hold the key to everything. Daniel nodded, his expression grave. It makes sense. The chapel was built on one of the oldest sites in the region. There's bound to be something hidden there, something they've been protecting for centuries. Eve's mind raced. The chapel was remote, far from prying eyes, and it fit the description of the place the book had been leading them to. But the more she thought about it, the more questions she had. What could be hidden there? She asked, voicing her thoughts aloud. And why was I chosen to find it? That's what we need to find out, Daniel said, his tone determined. But we need to be careful. The Crimson Key will stop at nothing to keep this secret. If we go there, we need to be prepared for whatever we might find. Eve nodded, a mixture of fear and resolve settling in her chest. She was in deeper than she had ever imagined, but she couldn't turn back now. The answers were out there, hidden in the ruins of the old stone chapel, and she was determined to find them. Chapter 7, The Ruins. The next day dawned grey and overcast, a thick fog rolling in from the hills that surrounded the town. Eve and Daniel set out early, determined to reach the old stone chapel before anyone else could track them. The fog was so dense that the world around them seemed to dissolve into a blur of shadows and muted colors. The chapel lay on the outskirts of town, hidden deep within a grove of ancient trees. As they approached, the air grew cooler, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling their nostrils. The path was narrow and overgrown, as though nature itself had conspired to keep the chapel hidden from the world. When they finally reached the clearing, the chapel stood before them like a forgotten relic. Its stone walls were weathered and cracked, ivy snaking up its sides, and the roof had long since caved in. The air around it was still, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. This is it, Eve said, her voice barely above a whisper. The place felt sacred, untouched by time, and yet there was an undeniable sense of foreboding in the air. Daniel nodded, his expression tense. We need to find the entrance to the vault. The book mentioned something about a hidden chamber, but it didn't say exactly where. Eve glanced around, her eyes scanning the crumbling walls for any sign of an opening. The chapel was small, little more than a single room with a few broken pews and a crumbling altar. But something about the place felt wrong, like there was more to it than met the eye. As they stepped inside, the fog seemed to thicken, muffling their footsteps as they moved through the chapel. Eve's hand brushed against the cold stone of the walls, searching for any sign of a hidden door, a loose brick, anything that might reveal the vault. But it was Daniel who found the first clue. Look at this, he said, pointing to a section of the floor near the altar. The stone tiles were worn and uneven, but one of them had a faint engraving, a symbol that matched the one in the book. Eve knelt down beside him, her heart pounding. This is it, she said, running her fingers over the engraved symbol. The entrance to the vault must be beneath this tile. Daniel nodded, his expression serious. Help me lift it. Together, they pried the stone tile loose, revealing a dark, narrow staircase descending into the earth. The air that wafted up from below was cold and musty, carrying with it the scent of ancient stone and something else, something faintly metallic. Eve's heart raced as she stared into the darkness. This was it, the moment they had been working towards. But as she prepared to descend the stairs, a sudden wave of doubt washed over her. What if they were walking into a trap? What if the vault wasn't what they expected? Daniel seemed to sense her hesitation. "We can do this," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever's down there, we'll face it together." Eve nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair, the darkness swallowing her whole. Chapter 8. The Vault. The descent into the vault was slow and cautious, the narrow stairs slick with moisture and worn smooth by centuries of use. The further they went, the colder the air became, until Eve could see her breath misting in the dim light of the lantern Daniel carried. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling down into the earth, the walls pressing in on either side. But finally, they reached the bottom, where the staircase opened up into a wide, low-ceilinged chamber. Eve's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight before her. The chamber was massive, its walls lined with shelves that held ancient tomes, scrolls, and artifacts. In the center of the room was a large stone table, and on it lay a single, ornate chest. "This is it," Daniel said, his voice filled with awe. "The vault." Eve approached the chest cautiously, her heart pounding. The chest was covered in intricate carvings, symbols that matched those in the book they had deciphered. The lock was large and heavy, clearly designed to keep out anyone who wasn't meant to open it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the key, her fingers trembling slightly as she fitted it into the lock. The key turned smoothly, the mechanism clicking into place with a sound that echoed through the chamber. Eve took a deep breath and lifted the lid of the chest. Inside, nestled in a bed of velvet, was a small, metal box. The box was plain, unmarked, but it radiated a sense of power, of significance. Eve hesitated for a moment, then reached out and lifted the box from the chest. "What do you think is inside?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel shook his head, his eyes fixed on the box. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's important enough for the Crimson Key to go to great lengths to protect it." Eve placed the box on the stone table and carefully pried it open. Inside, she found a single, folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age but otherwise perfectly preserved. She unfolded the parchment and read the words written in a delicate, flowing script. "To those who seek the truth, know this. The knowledge contained within these walls is both a blessing and a curse. It holds the power to change the world, but with that power comes great responsibility. Use it wisely, for once the truth is known, it cannot be undone." Eve stared at the parchment, the weight of its words pressing down on her. This was what they had been searching for, the truth that the Crimson Key had sought to protect for centuries. But now that she had it, what was she supposed to do with it? Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression grave. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low. "The Crimson Key will know we've been here. They won't stop until they get this back." Eve nodded, her mind still reeling from what they had uncovered. She carefully folded the parchment and placed it back in the box, then closed the lid and locked it with the key. As they turned to leave the vault, Eve couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The truth they had uncovered was powerful, but it was also dangerous. And now that it was in her hands, she knew there would be no escaping the consequences. Chapter 9. A Narrow Escape. The journey back up the narrow staircase was even more nerve-wracking than the descent. Every creak of the old stones, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls set Eve's nerves on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that at any moment, someone would come charging down the stairs to stop them. When they finally emerged from the staircase into the dim light of the chapel, Eve felt a rush of relief, short-lived, however, as the hair on the back of her neck stood up. They weren't alone. Daniel noticed it, too. He grabbed Eve's arm and pulled her to the side, into the shadows near the crumbling altar. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his eyes scanning the darkened chapel. Eve held her breath, straining to hear over the pounding of her own heart. For a moment, all was silent. Then she heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing off the stone walls. "They've found us," Daniel muttered, his grip on her arm tightening. "We need to get out, now." They moved as quietly as they could towards the side door, hoping to slip away unnoticed. But just as they reached the door, it burst open, and 2 men stepped into the chapel, blocking their escape. "Going somewhere?" one of the men sneered, his voice cold and menacing. He was tall, with a build that spoke of power, and his eyes were sharp, assessing them with a predator's gaze. Eve's heart pounded in her chest. They were trapped. The men were between them and the only exit. Daniel stepped forward, his stance protective. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just let us go, and no one has to get hurt." The second man, shorter and stockier, laughed a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Oh, we'll let you go," he said, stepping closer. "But not before we get what you took." Eve clutched the box tightly, her mind racing. She couldn't let them have it, not after everything they had been through to get it. But how could they possibly escape? Daniel glanced at her, his eyes filled with determination. "Run," he whispered, so softly that only she could hear. "What?" Eve whispered back, confusion and fear mixing in her voice. "Run," Daniel repeated, more urgently this time. "I'll distract them. You get out of here, take the box, and don't stop until you're safe." Eve's heart sank. She didn't want to leave him behind, but she knew he was right. There was no other way. Before she could second-guess herself, Eve turned and bolted for the back of the chapel, where a small, half-collapsed window offered a narrow escape route. She heard Daniel shout something, followed by the sound of a struggle, but she didn't look back. She squeezed through the window, scraping her arms on the jagged edges of the stone, and tumbled out into the cold, damp night. The fog had thickened, swallowing the world in a dense, white haze, but Eve didn't hesitate. She ran, clutching the box to her chest, her feet pounding against the uneven ground. She didn't stop, didn't look back, even as the sounds of pursuit echoed through the fog behind her. The only thought in her mind was to get away, to keep the box safe. Finally, when her lungs burned and her legs ached, Eve stumbled to a halt, collapsing against a tree at the edge of the forest. The fog was so thick that she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, but the sounds of pursuit had faded, and she was alone. Gasping for breath, Eve held the box tightly, her mind reeling from the night's events. She had escaped for now, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the Crimson Key found her again. And when they did, she would have to be ready. Epilogue, Shadows of Tomorrow. Eve stood at the edge of the forest, the mist swirling around her like a living thing. The night had been long, filled with dangers and discoveries she never could have imagined. She looked down at the box in her hands, feeling the weight of the secrets it held, the secrets she was now responsible for. The Crimson Key would come for her, of that she was certain. But she also knew that she wasn't the same person she had been before. She was stronger, more determined, and she wouldn't stop until she uncovered the full truth. As she turned and disappeared into the fog, the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, a new day beginning, one filled with possibilities, dangers, and the promise of answers just beyond reach. If you enjoyed this story and are curious about what happens next, please leave a comment below. Your support and feedback are incredibly valuable, and I'd love to hear what you think. Want to see more of Eve's journey? Hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated on future adventures. Your engagement keeps the story alive. These prompts are designed to subtly encourage readers to interact without feeling pressured, fostering a sense of community and anticipation for what comes next.